All right, so today we're going to talk about public problems and policy alternatives, and how our values influence how we define problems. So I want to start with an example using Alabama immigration policy. As you can see from the headline, Alabama farmers losing immigrant labor see produce rotting in the fields. So, Alabama passed a law that requires citizens to prove citizenship for basic government services, much like a law previously passed in Arizona. Residents soon found themselves unable to cope with the new requirements. They could not locate a birth certificate. Other people had paperwork, but had to spend hours proving citizenship for government services. One lawmaker was quoted as saying, the longer the bill has been out, the more unintended consequences. So Alabama farmers learned that they might suffer economic loss, the loss of farm workers due to strict guidelines, and Americans unwilling to fill certain farm jobs. So this leads to the question: well, what is the solution? What's the solution to um, uh, cutting down on immigrant labor? Uh, you know, President Trump would say, build a wall. Do you punish employers who employ um, immigrants, illegal immigrants, or do you have like more border patrol agents? Our solution is often a product of how we define a problem, and how we define a problem oftentimes comes from what we value. So, problem analysis is used to understand the nature of the problem and the magnitude of the problem. The beginning of any policy study involves a description of the problem. Some are straightforward, others not so much. And how you define the problem is influenced by your values. So, if you're looking at the problem in uh, in terms of what's good for the collective whole, uh, what's good for everybody, what's good for all of society, then you might be coming at a problem differently than if you're looking at it from a perspective that values individual liberty. So, um, some are more straightforward than others. If uh, if we're looking at teenage smoking, we can find data on how many teenagers smoke and why they choose to smoke. Uh, Other issues are more complicated. And problem analysis is used to understand the nature of the problem and the magnitude of the problem. So uh, we have to have definitions and measures. We must define our terms. For example, if we want to create a policy that combats poverty, we need to then define poverty. The federal government considers poverty in the 48 contiguous states for a family of four to be $24,300 a year. Is that really realistic? Are there people struggling that make more than that collectively? For a family of four, $24,000 isn't really that much. So how we define poverty matters if we're going to use public policy to alleviate it. Uh, we often use operational measures, quantitative indicators of a problem. Uh, how's the how is the economy doing? What kind of economic policy do we need? Well, what's going to bring down unemployment? Uh, those kinds of things, and how we define those things matter. But while the rationalist looks at the policy problem from the view of trying to be objective and measure things and assess alternatives, and you have like the cost benefit analysis uh, approach, the the role of values ultimately matters. And Deborah Stone, uh, states that problem definition is never simply a matter of defining goals and measuring the distance from them. It's rather a strategic representation of situations. We have an issue framing as a factor. So policymakers and interest groups will do whatever they can to set a policy agenda in their favor by defining the problem their way. Do we have, when it comes to public sector unions, do we have a collective right to bargain for better wages and better working conditions? Is this issue defined as an economic issue? Do labor unions increase wages for the middle class? Or is it defined as a personal liberty issue where workers should not be paying dues or agency fees to a union that they don't agree with politically, and they shouldn't have to associate with a group that they don't want to. So if you're looking at it as through an economic lens, you might get a different answer than if you're looking at it from a freedom and liberty lens. So our values definitely play a role in how we define a problem, which then influences our evaluative criteria, how we evaluate the success of one policy over another, and assess alternatives. After problem analysis has yielded a good sense of what the problem is and how extensive it is, why it occurs, and what the goals are for resolving it, the next step is to think about a course of action, policy implementation. What can we actually do to construct policy that will get at the problem? And governments have a number of different things they can do to address a public problem. They can regulate, so this includes licensing, inspection, enforcing standards. They can subsidize, so they can loan money, they can make direct payments or benefits, they can provide tax credits. They can ration, limit access to certain resources. All governments tax and spend, so they can tax an activity at a level that encourages or discourages that activity. So this is this is common when we see the sin tax, so high taxes on products like cigarettes and alcohol, because we know that cigarettes are linked to lung cancer, so we want to discourage people from smoking cigarettes, so we tax them at a high rate to discourage the public from smoking. We can contract out. More and more and more, governments contract out services. So this is where the public sector and the private sector work together by contract. So governments will contract out services to the private sector or buy products from the private sector for government agencies. Your local government does this a lot of times with things like trash collection. They contract out with a trash collection company to collect your trash each week rather than hiring government employees to do so. The use of market incentives, so taxation and fees that create incentives to change behavior and achieve goals. Privatize, so transferring a public service from the government to the private sector, so taking some kind of service and taking it out of the government's hands. This has mixed results, but it is a solution. These all have mixed results, actually, but privatization is one tool the government can use to assess a public problem. Charge fees for selected services. That's pretty self-explanatory. Educate. So you see a lot of education campaigns that are publicly funded to try and cut down on a public problem. So when it comes to like texting and driving, making texting and driving illegal and ticketing people for it is one way, but also just educating people on the dangers of texting while driving. We see a large education campaign on highways and billboards and commercials about the dangers of texting and driving. So education can play a key role too. Create public trust, so holding public property in trust for citizens indefinitely, so public parks, national parks, recreation areas, and conducting research. One thing government can do is help support research and the development of research that will help us define and create policy alternatives for public problems. Now, the different ways that we can think creatively about policy action. How do we go about figuring out what public policy to move forward with? So there's a few different strategies for this. We can do no action analysis. You begin with the status quo or the present policy and suggest that government do nothing about a given problem, but that the present policies or programs or defending them may be a viable option. So maybe there is a problem, but the current status quo is actually the best solution for that problem, that doing something else would actually be worse. We can do a quick survey, talking with people about a particular policy network, or searching through hearing transcripts, minutes from meetings, newspaper accounts, looking for pertinent information about the policy problem and alternatives. Literature review, which involves the examination of books and journal articles and internet resources and different resources on what is out there about this policy. Passive collection, finding what others have suggested in a given policy area. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to coming up with a policy alternative. You can figure out what other countries or what other states are doing. Parallel situation, look at a parallel situation in another policy area and consider what might be done. So, with the texting and driving campaign is very similar to the drunk driving education campaign. That's probably not a coincidence. So, educating people about public service with public service announcements, educating people about the dangers of drunk driving, was part of what cut down on drunk driving. So the government is taking a very similar approach when it comes to public education with texting. And so they likely looked at a parallel situation. Well, what did we do about drunk driving? Let's do the same thing about texting while driving. Brainstorming, simply informally meeting with people who share the interest in finding solutions to a given problem. So you engage with the people that are impacted by the problem and get their thoughts about what the possible solutions are, and think about the ideal situation. So compare policy alternatives with an ideal situation. Ask yourself what would be the ideal situation, and then figure out how you use that to move in the desired direction. So not that we can ever reach the ideal, but it might be good to think about what an ideal situation would be, and that might help brainstorm some ideas for what policy action we need to take. All right, so thank you.